All right. Hello, my name is Cedric Reeves with Attachment Repair Podcast. Today we'll be interviewing Elise Kushner. Elise lives in Cologne, Germany, and is a practitioner of coherence therapy and also a certified trainer of coherence therapy and coaching, and also a trainer in the area of interpersonal communication, coaching competencies for leaders, and gender awareness. She is the co-author of the Listening Book, which I'll show you all right here, just released this year in 2023. Elise is also a composer and choral director and sings in an oldies band. What drew you into the field? And also, you can construe field as both coaching and psychotherapy. I think answering both of those would be interesting.
Yeah. Well, I've always wanted to be a detective when I was a little kid, and maybe even an anthropologist. And I've also always been drawn to interpersonal communications and just emotional ways of being with other people. And then along the way, somehow I got kind of stuck in the IT world, largely because it paid well and I was a single mom and I needed the money. But all that time I was taking classes in systemic coaching and NLP. And then I did what in German is called Heilpraktiker, that means healing practitioner, which was a way of getting a license to practice psychotherapy in Germany. And all the while I was aware of coherence therapy, and somehow I always knew that was my home. It just feels very good, non-pathologizing, respectful, and very effective.
Okay. And then also you knew about it because your sister had gotten involved with it earlier, kind of in the early
My
days.
sister, Robin Tissick, is also co-author of various books, including what's kind of the standard work, Unlocking the Emotional Brain. And so I was always, reading the drafts of the book and my feedback, and I was deeply into it, even before I started doing my own psychotherapy.
Yeah, that's a bit of an uncommon way into a modality. Usually people obviously, do the kind of the university training, but okay. Tell me about structure and your structure and theoretical orientation. Like as I bring that up, what comes up to mind on your end?
Yeah, well, what is coherence therapy? It's a set of concepts and methods for achieving deeply transformational change, and change that is also sustainable for clients. Now, there are other modalities where the client learns new behaviors that kind of compete with the old behaviors, but in coherence therapy, we work deeply and work toward finding the deepest roots of a symptom that the client wants to change. Right from the first session, we put our focus on guiding the client to look to the deeper meanings and the deeper emotional learnings that up until now have remained hidden and unconscious from the client. You know yourself, when a client comes in with a symptom, it's very often, why does this happen? It happens automatically. I try with discipline to suppress it, but it doesn't work, or it only works for a short while. There must be something wrong with me. This is the client not being consciously aware of what the deeper coherent reasons are for these symptoms, which leads me really to the core concept in coherence therapy, and that is the concept of symptom coherence. As soon as we hear what the symptom is that the client wants to change, although we have great empathy for the suffering of living with that symptom, at the same time, we are thinking always in the back of our minds, what makes this symptom make sense
Okay.
and what makes this symptom necessary to have
Mm-hmm.
given the existing emotional learnings
Mm-hmm.
underlying this
Mm-hmm.
symptom,
Mm-hmm.
even if we don't know what those are yet.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first order of business, is to do what we call discovery work.
Okay.
We use the symptom as kind of a portal
Mm-hmm.
into the deeper material, and we follow the symptom where it naturally goes.
Okay.
We don't interpret things. We
Uh-huh.
don't hypothesize. Well, maybe in the back of our minds, we're always using models and knowledge and life experience to
Uh-huh.
hypothesize some way to give us
Yeah.
some instincts about maybe what to try out,
Uh-huh.
so on. But in the foreground, we're knowing that we don't know what
Yeah.
the
Yep.
emotional learnings
Right.
are that
Mm-hmm.
make this symptom necessary to have.
Okay.
We're,
Now, one
yeah.
kind of one follow-up question. So about the non-interpreting, I mean, you have a hypothesis, but you don't interpret. But so I know that, and so coherence therapy influences the way I work. And so sometimes I'll like offer like, well, is it this, when the client is stuck in terms of finding what the kind of coherent reason is for the symptom. Um, like, yeah, give me some feedback on that. Is that handling it the right way?
Mhm. Well, it's not a yes or a no. It
Okay.
depends how well you know your client.
Uh-huh.
Depends how well you can sort of judge whether the client will honestly tell you if you're on the wrong
Oh,
track.
oh, uh-huh.
So it's not our first choice
Okay. Yep.
offer our own interpretations.
Yeah.
What does happen sometimes, if I know a client really well and I have a hunch
Yeah.
what might be going on, I might say it in a way of wondering whether da 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 might in some way be related.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of wondering,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
we'll see how the client reacts. But actually, the first choice is always to elicit the material from the
Yeah.
client.
Mm-hmm.
That's my main job. And
Mm-hmm.
coherence therapy offers some good methods and techniques for doing that. Some very effective and
Okay.
direct methods and techniques.
Yeah.
And at the same time, other experiential methods and techniques from other types of therapy, somatic therapies,
Mm-hmm.
talk therapies, parts
Yeah.
therapies,
Parts work.
uh, mm, narrative therapies
Mm-hmm.
are also perfectly
Mm-hmm.
valid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The main thing is to work with an assumption of coherence,
Mm-hmm.
to work in such a way that we don't counteract
Uh-huh.
anything that the client comes up with.
Uh-huh. So kind of like push against, oh, we need to get rid of this, that kind of thing. We don't do that. We
Mhm.
like kind of embrace everything that the client brings up. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we
Yeah.
largely assume there's a meaning, there's a purpose, there's a function of the symptom, or even, for example, their resistance to whatever moving on or whatever it is.
hmm
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes we'll hear a clear emotional truth coming from a client, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe we'll suggest try saying this out
Mm-hmm.
loud,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
try saying this imaginally
Mm-hmm.
to the relevant person.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the client is much too uncomfortable with doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And in many types of therapy, people would say, "Oh, resistance, that's a bad thing." We
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
greet it, oh,
Yep.
we welcome it, because we say, "Aha," that gives us more knowledge about what's going on
Yep.
emotionally.
Yep.
And we focus then on the so-called resistance as
Yeah.
a very coherent reaction to what's going on in the
Right.
therapeutic process.
Right. And I'll just add, I mean, one of the things that I like so much about coherence therapy is that it feels depathologizing, and then also it feels very attuning. It's like, oh, okay, so there is this belief, like you have this deep emotional knowing, and then
Mm.
just having it seen instead of having it combated from the outside, which I think that
Mhm.
that's the normal response that the world has around our whatever, we'll call it psychological symptoms. So it's really refreshing
Mhm.
to do. I'll add that. But
Depathologizing, and there's then the next deepest
okay.
level of experience for a client when the client recognizes his or her own agency in
Uh-huh.
creating the symptom
Yeah.
as a solution
Hmm.
to an existential dilemma. There's this moment sometimes that's just fulfilling and beautiful when
Hmm.
we see the light go on and the client says, "That's why I do this.
Yeah.
Wow, I
Yeah.
had this dilemma, I had this problem
Yeah.
back then,
Yeah.
whenever it might be.
Yeah.
And this was a way of avoiding a major suffering."
Right.
Wow.
Right.
And Bruce Ecker, one of the founders of Coherence Therapy, calls that the pivot into
Oh,
agency.
pivot into agency. Okay.
Yes,
Great.
it's a very
Great.
powerful milestone, you could
Yeah.
say.
I was maybe add some to it. So it's like, yeah, the client kind of goes and they see that there was actually a strategy behind why I developed this symptom. And then so they're literally discovering that, and then thereby finding how they in fact were taking like an agentic stance at the time, instead of kind of just being this, I don't know, confused victim or something. So they were already,
Mhm.
in a sense, trying to manage themselves. But then, of course, I guess there's always were some positive or negative externalities or side effects. Okay.
Yeah, maybe we can take a concrete example.
Okay.
Let's say there's a university student who's supposed to be writing a paper and just can't get, let's say it's a man, just can't get
Yeah.
himself to get to work on it and keeps procrastinating and procrastinating and comes to you to figure out what's going on. There's something wrong with me. I've tried
Yeah.
efficiency training, and
Hmm.
I use the Pomodoro technique. I set my alarm for however
Yeah.
many minutes and I try to concentrate, but I'm just not getting anywhere. And he's beating himself up over it. He looks around him and sees other people doing it differently
Yeah.
or better.
Yeah.
And during the course of therapy, um, he figures out that that's a solution to the
Uh-huh.
problem of being in a course of study that he really doesn't want. He
Um,
really didn't choose. His parents chose it for him.
yeah.
And he knows
Hmm.
on a deep emotional level that he cannot go against his parents'
Uh-huh.
wishes.
Uh-huh.
And so something in him is trying to get him out of that dilemma of feeling
Hmm.
stuck between his own desires and not being able to share it with his parents.
Hmm.
And how that then gets transformed is very
Uh,
specific
yeah.
to that person, but
Yeah.
many times, even just the conscious awareness of, oh, that's why I'm doing
Uh-huh.
this,
Hmm.
is sometimes enough for the person to realize, ah, I'm not a child anymore. I have other
Hmm.
options. That's a kind of disconfirming knowledge.
Hmm.
On the deep
Hmm.
emotional level, he's still the child who cannot buck his parents.
Mm,
And
right.
then on an adult level, he finds he knows other things about himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, he can use his words to find another path with his parents, for example.
Right.
It's a possibility how that can go. We don't
Right.
know. It's a fictional person,
Sure.
but
Sure.
uh,
So obviously I do a lot of work on attachment, and then I take in some of these, um, what would it be, principles of coherence therapy. And so, and then incidentally, a lot of my clients are more on the dismissing end, so dismissing, avoiding. And one of the things that I think my clients keep discovering in our process is in a sense, okay, so I think part of dismissing attachment is like dismissing self and actually repressing emotional needs, especially repressing negative emotion. And so what we're discovering is that this repressing of negative emotion was necessary in their early environments growing up. Mom and dad did not feel on average comfortable with negative affect. And so they learned to repress it. And of course, now in adulthood, they kind of like beat up on themselves for like struggling with getting in touch with their emotions and even their negative emotions. But like I'm always trying to remind them, it's like, but remember why, remember how like this was necessary over and over. Anyhow, that's just what I just thought to just add that as a different as an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's interesting about such an example is that for each person, it's going to be a little bit different. There are going to be some people whose deepest level of emotional knowing about that is it's not safe to feel negative affect. Yeah, that even within the attachment style of dismissive, there are, as much as there may be similarities in understanding the models, give us sensitivity to certain kinds of signals and so on. There's still going to be people who very concretely have unique personal learnings about that, right? Because every family dynamic is a little bit different. And even the genetics of the brain of the child back then are unique. And so that's why it's so important to work experientially to help the person to find really all of the nuances about the scenes back then that helped the person, helped the client learn what this means when mom does that. That means when dad does that, and how that person knows to implement exactly that present solution. Because the specificity of the symptom is what's going to help us find the specificity of disconfirming information that can possibly change those constructs.
Gee, there was something I was going to comment here. It's like, I think, it's obviously interesting and helpful to get familiar with these, let's say, attachment patterns. And then I find it kind of interesting and useful to categorize my clients or categorize the behavior. But then certainly it's their issues, this individual's issues that you're working on. And then what I kind of hear you saying is that this is why it's important to take this don't know mind posture with what they're presenting. And like, of course you can, like you're saying, you can have a hunch, but you need to really have this kind of like open curiosity about, well, I don't know, but let's figure it out together kind of posture.
Yeah, and absolutely no agenda. Talking about, I've mentioned a couple of times, disconfirming knowings and transformation.
Let's figure out what that is. Tell us about it.
Yeah, we do need to get into how coherence therapy is very much using native abilities of the brain to retrieve and transform emotional knowings. In the 80s and 90s of the last century, Bruce Ecker and Laurel Hulley were psychotherapists, are still, and they worked together, and they, at some point, also as detectives, wanted to figure out in those cases where their clients made permanent and deep transformations, what had led to that. A lot of psychotherapy is kind of hit and miss. You try things out, and some things work and some things don't work. And they started seeing a pattern and started codifying that pattern. And that's what is now coherence therapy. They actually wrote about it in a book in 1995 called Depth-Oriented Brief Therapy, which was the old name for what is now coherence therapy. And they found that there was a process, a rigorous process, assuming the coherence of the symptoms and moving through phases of discovery, what the underlying emotional learnings are, then a phase of integration into awareness of what has been discovered, because what's in awareness can be changed, and what's hidden and unconscious is not a very easy way to change the symptoms that result from it, right?
So it's to kind of discover what's underlying the symptom. How does this symptom work into my psyche, maybe somewhat generally? Again, how is it useful? And then kind of soaking in that, mulling it over sufficient that it starts to integrate into general awareness and is available optimally in everyday daily type life.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And even more optimally is available at those moments that those very specific triggers happen that make the symptom be implemented, right? Because at those moments, that's when the brain has a chance to say, aha, is this absolutely necessary right now? Right? And the answer may be yes, but there's at least chance for what we call spontaneous juxtaposition at those times.
Okay. What you're saying is it's especially helpful to have full conscious access to the kind of understanding of the symptom, why it's there, why it's necessary, especially in the moment that you're triggered, and when that kind of learning comes back online and is about to direct behavior. And then the trick is not whether or not, or at least the emphasis in coherence therapy is not whether or not to follow through with the kind of symptom or the behavior that's somewhat problematic or not, is just to see and just to really kind of have the whole, we'll call it structure in conscious awareness at that point. And that then there's, like you're saying, possibility for even spontaneous juxtaposition.
In the late 90s and leading up to the year 2000, neuroscientists discovered an innate process in the brain, first in animals and then in humans, called memory reconsolidation. Now, maybe a lot of people know the concept generally of memory consolidation. When we learn something, no matter what it is, the question is, does it stay only in short-term memory or does it get consolidated into long-term memory? And we've known for a long time that learning, emotional learning that takes place under extreme emotion, tends to be very tenacious. Right. So for a very long time, people thought that emotional learnings could not be changed. That the best that you could possibly do would be to learn counteractive techniques to keep those emotional learnings from taking over your life or making you do certain things that you don't want to do. Well, the neuroscientists found that under very particular circumstances, it is possible to retrieve, reactivate these old emotional learnings. And then if the brain, at the time that that's reactivated, if the brain is confronted with just as active a set of contradictory knowings, This is why it all has to be experiential. It has to be
Mm-hmm.
active and real and in the
Mm-hmm.
room and feeling true.
Mm-hmm.
And the brain's innate mismatch detector,
Uh-huh.
that doesn't like things that are
Mm-hmm.
contradictory,
Mm-hmm.
at that moment says, oh, wait a minute, these can't both be true at
Mm-hmm.
the same
Mm-hmm.
time. And so the original synapses, somehow chemically, biologically, I don't know, I'm not the expert there, but the original synapses where that learning is
Mm-hmm.
stored become labile
Mm-hmm.
and open to change.
Mm-hmm.
And what the
Mm-hmm.
brain then does, based on this mismatch or juxtaposition, we
Mm-hmm.
could call it, between two sets of knowings that
Mm-hmm.
can't both be true at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, the brain chooses what feels most right and most
Mm-hmm.
true,
Mm-hmm.
which may be the newer knowings, may not
Mm-hmm.
be. No,
Yeah.
there's no
Yeah.
guarantee, right?
Yeah.
And reconsolidates
Mm-hmm.
that area of learning with,
Mm-hmm.
we hope, the new emotional knowings.
I'll just interject here. Something I tell my clients to watch out for is to notice this sense of confusion, and that's a good sign. Like this, like, wait, hold up, wait, which one of these is right? It's like, wait, but there's this old knowing, but then, well, but I also know this, because like I think sometimes people will like kind of feel the confusion feels a bit weird and unsettling, and
Mhm.
will then back off. So I'm like, no, that's a good sign. So anyway, I just thought to interject that.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the signs of something going on there
Yeah,
that the brain isn't quite used to,
yeah.
and something's taking place and something will come out of it. And another sign is when it's very clear, let's say, that the new knowings are the ones that the brain
Mm-hmm.
wants to reconsolidate and hold on to. Sometimes a person will burst into hysterical laughing and say, that's so obvious now. How
Yeah,
could I
yeah,
ever have thought that da da da
yeah,
was true,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so it's very interesting to watch it happen real time,
Yeah.
which does happen sometimes in the therapy sessions.
Uh-huh.
And a good 50% of the time it happens outside the
Right,
therapy sessions,
right.
that people, because they have so much more awareness of their old
Uh-huh.
learnings, they notice things
Yeah, they
that they
notice the
otherwise wouldn't
disconfirmation.
have.
Mm-hmm.
Right, right. Like, had a client who felt that everyone was always looking at him, watching him,
Uh-huh.
criticizing him. And
Uh-huh.
then he had an experience in a social setting where everyone was busy
Mm-hmm.
doing his or her own thing, dancing with closed eyes and not paying any attention to anybody else.
Yeah, yeah.
And he suddenly noticed that, in fact, nobody was noticing him and nobody even cared how he
Yeah.
was dressed, what he looked like, how he was dancing.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was a spontaneous juxtaposition that was
Huh.
possible because he was in full awareness
Yeah.
of his old emotional learnings.
Huh.
Yeah. So what Ecker and Hulley noticed is that the process for memory reconsolidation
Mm-hmm.
that was described by the neuroscientists
Mm-hmm.
matched one to one with the rigorous
Mm-hmm.
clinical process that they had defined
Mm-hmm.
in coherence therapy. And I guess that sort of merging happened, I don't know, around the year 2005 or so. And since
Okay.
then, it's been a very clear process of trying to
Mm-hmm.
make clear how what they call the therapeutic reconsolidation
Okay.
process
Yep.
can be implemented intentionally
Yeah.
in therapy sessions,
Mm-hmm.
and not just with coherence therapy.
Mm-hmm.
They have
Mm-hmm.
studied more and more, and many people are studying this now, how other types of therapy,
Mm-hmm.
EMDR and ADP and IFS and
Uh-huh.
various other types of therapy,
Yep.
actually implement the therapeutic
Mm-hmm.
reconsolidation process, even
Mm-hmm.
though it doesn't go exactly according to coherence therapy process.
Right.
And there are many examples of that in the Unlocking the Emotional
Mm-hmm.
Brain,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the way, is coming out next April in a second edition.
Oh.
with many more case examples
Okay.
from additional therapy modalities.
Okay.
So in a way, we could say that this reconsolidation process is kind of a way of unifying and integrating
Yeah.
many different therapeutic approaches.
Yeah, I think Bruce talks about kind of, in a certain sense, like kind of developing a more scientific rigor about the therapeutic process, and so in a certain sense, I think that's part of their contributions in this area. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so you work rather strictly with a coherence therapy model. And so how do you accommodate attachment issues? How do you think about attachment issues? Just feel free to launch into that general topic.
Yeah. Of course, attachment issues underlie many
Mm-hmm.
problems that people come to therapy with, but not all, as I'm sure you know. And there are
Sure.
many domains of
Mhm.
experience that cause people suffering and cause people dilemmas, and growing up in a disadvantaged socioeconomic
Sure.
environment, having complex gender identity
Sure.
issues, experiencing existential pain in the area of illness or aging,
Mm-hmm.
losing loved ones, or bullying in school. I mean, there are just a million examples
Sure.
of things that lead to suffering and
Yeah.
lead
Yeah.
to the need to look for solutions, unconscious
Mm-hmm.
need to look for solutions to dilemmas.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's a first point, that in a way, attachment issues are like any other
Mm-hmm.
issues in coherence therapy, in that we start out by not knowing
Mm-hmm.
what the underlying cause of the
Mm-hmm.
symptom is. And it's useful, as I mentioned before, to have these models
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
different attachment
Sure.
styles. Just the way it's useful to have some knowledge of transactional analysis for communication styles,
Totally.
just as it's useful to know about the hierarchy of needs. I love
Sure.
models, I love learning,
Yep.
and they're all somewhere in the back of
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
mind, uh, as are all of my individual experiences with
Mm-hmm.
clients up till now, because they enrich my sensitivity,
Yep.
and
Yep.
they help me form, let's say, gentle hypotheses
Yeah.
that
Uh-huh.
make me curious,
Yeah.
anthropologically curious about this or that.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, I work the same way with all clients
And also all types of issues, basically.
on all types of
Mm-hmm.
issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It would be interesting for you to talk about functional and functionless symptoms, how you differentiate them, how you deal with them differently. Also, I'd be kind of curious if you if you have a guesstimate as to the percent of issues brought into therapy. Like, let's say they're 80% functional issues, 20% functionless. Anyway, just launch into any of those questions that you might
Mhm.
find interesting.
Okay, so maybe first we could define that for the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
viewers and listeners.
Yeah.
Mm, When we first hear what the symptom is that the client wants to work on, we don't know whether that symptom is a direct solution
Mm-hmm.
to an existing dilemma,
Yeah.
or whether that symptom, and that would be a functional
Mm-hmm.
symptom, or whether that symptom is, let's say, the outgrowth,
Mm-hmm.
a follow-on symptom to a choice, a strategy, another symptom that
Mm-hmm.
uh, would be functional to solve a dilemma. So just as an example that makes it very clear,
Yep.
if a 30-year-old woman comes to me and says, I'm so frustrated by my overweight. I've been struggling with it ever since my teen years, and I try to diet and it doesn't, I don't stick to it for very long and so on, but I have no idea why this is so hard. And with, let's say we clone this woman sort of, and we have two people with exactly the same initial description. And the first one, after discovery work, finds out that the overweight is in itself a solution to a problem. It's a functional symptom. She was sexually abused in her teen years by some relative, and she unconsciously figured out that making herself unattractive in this particular way, it was the way that was available to her unconsciously, made this relative leave her alone. Okay. So that's the discovery work, and then integration and transformation are another chapter. This other 30-year-old woman who's fighting with overweight does the discovery work and finds out that she had a really cozy, loving childhood with her overweight parents who used food to calm them from the stress of the day. And she learned that as a solution to dealing with stress and having her body just slow down and feel somehow cozy and homey. And so for her, the functional symptom was eating particular foods, particular amounts. And as a result of that, she's gained a lot of weight and is frustrated with that. So the overweight in the second case is non-functional.
Right. So the eating has a function of being emotionally soothing, but then the overweight itself is functionless.
Right. Yeah. And it's an interesting question, what percentage? I've never thought about that, and I don't really have an answer. And the truth is that most of my clients come in with much more complex situations where we're dealing with some mixture of functionless and functional symptoms, and it's a fair amount of work to pluck them apart, see them as different strands in this macrame here. And so I don't know, can't really answer that question. The important thing for us as therapists is to remember at all times that we don't know this symptom is functional or functionless. We use very focused techniques to find that out. What underlies this.
And then I'll just add that it seems like coherence therapy really presents its strengths when dealing with the functional symptoms, whereas the functionless symptoms, it seems like there could be understanding. This is just like kind of an unintended consequence or some sort of negative externality relating back to this. But then it seems like there's not much to be done, at least from the coherence therapy frame of mind, or am I understanding that correctly, around the functionless symptoms?
Well, I would just say that it's a slightly more complex structure, and the goal still applies to get to the bottom of what makes this cascade of symptoms happen. And when the construct that necessitates this cascade of symptoms no longer exists, then they all drop away, functional and non-functional.
Right. So I guess when you run across functionless symptoms, there's typically less work directly done on that. Rather, you find the functional symptoms who in a roundabout way
underlie there. And I'd also like to mention that there are cases where there is no functional symptom. There are
Uh-huh.
cases where a person exists in a dilemma and knows no way out. And the symptom is perhaps panic or helplessness
Yeah.
at not having a
Yeah.
solution.
Totally.
So there are functionless symptoms where we really focus on what that means,
Yeah.
get to what's causing it, and then see whether that dilemma still exists the way it did back then when it was learned, and so on.
Right. How do you deal with difficult clients? And I think that I think that you might have some interesting responses about that. And also feel free to massage the definition of difficult client.
Mm. Yeah, two different types of difficult clients occur to me. One is where
Okay.
the person is really not aligned with what I think we're doing. And I did
Uh-huh.
one occasion where a woman truly misunderstood what coherence
Uh-huh.
therapy is.
Hmm.
She thought um, that I would somehow help her retrieve old bad meanings, and I would insert for her some new good meanings into her brain or
Okay.
something.
Okay.
And I didn't realize at first that that was her expectation. And she was more and more frustrated with the process, which I, of course, interpreted as resistance in some way that we could look at.
Right.
Right? I shifted my attention to her
Right, right.
frustration.
Oh, you're very
And
frustrated.
yeah, and what
Go ahead.
ultimately came out of it was, you're not doing to me what I hired you to do to me,
Right.
right? Okay, so we agreed that we should stop working together.
So
We
the symptom was that Elise was violating the contract.
apparently, yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's
Understood.
one type of quote unquote difficult
Sure.
client. But I mean, her desires were also very coherent. They just weren't in line with what I could offer her.
Yeah. Sure. Sure. That makes sense.
Right. And other than that, I I mean, you could define difficult. I don't even like to use
Yeah.
the word that
Yeah.
way. Like, let's
Just
say
take it as a
long-term,
go ahead.
long-term complex cases.
Okay. Yeah. Tell
Which
us
some
about that.
people might define as difficult. I define them as long-term and complex. And the thing is, that's so satisfying, is
Uh-huh.
that in coherence therapy, we have a concrete goal that every session makes some progress in the
Hmm.
area of discovery, integration, or transformation.
Okay. Yep.
And a session that does that keeps both therapist and client engaged
Yeah.
and full.
Yeah. And I'll just say
Yeah.
that that was my experience with doing coherence therapy as a client.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it keeps you engaged and hopeful. And so as difficult and long-winded as some processes may be, they're also fulfilling,
Hmm.
usually to both parties in some way, because we're getting somewhere.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there just are complex cases, people who have complex childhood attachment trauma.
Oh yeah.
You know, from working in that area, that
Yeah.
these things get these these constructs, they become filters through which
Yeah.
the person starting in early childhood sees everything, every
Uh-huh.
relationship, every endeavor, every response from the outside world,
And
and
also self.
self, yes.
Mm.
And so there's a lot to unpack,
Hmm.
a lot to change, and also such cases bring us up against the whole question of, what is my identity in the world? And if I start changing these
Mhm.
basic things that are how I've always been and how the world has always been, then who am I? Do I even exist? It's something that has to be taken slowly and delicately.
Mhm.
And as long as there's something happening,
Mhm.
we keep on working.
So one thing, I struggled with one client a while back on around the issues of helplessness. So, I'd be working with the client, trying to get them to kind of go through this process, but then there would be this, I think maybe, I don't know, maybe some sort of frustration came up. And then there was this like presentation of helplessness, kind of like, I can't do this. I think I'm doing it wrong, this kind of thing. And it kind of would like loop over and over. And then the way that I dealt with it, approximately using a coherence therapy frame, is like, okay, all right, so there's this helplessness coming up. Let's like look at this. Let's see how this is important, how it's strategic, how this helps. Like kind of doing like the symptom deprivation thing. Like imagine that you couldn't present helplessness, and then let's see the even greater suffering that would arise from that, and then thereby kind of working backwards and finding the utility of the helplessness. But and then sometimes I'd get a little bit of buy-in on that frame, but then it seemed like there would be this kind of insistence on going back to the helpless frame, such that I think that both I and this client got frustrated. Um, so of course I'm trying to give you all the hard cases here, but okay, any thoughts on that kind of situation? And then I have another, again, quote unquote, difficult type client that maybe you could opine on, but go ahead.
Yeah, I always come back to the basics of
Mhm.
coherence therapy and do what you actually did and try to
Yeah,
find out the coherent need to be helpless
yeah, right, right,
and stay with that
yeah,
until something becomes clear.
right, right. So always make the resistance the object, or make it
Focus, yeah.
the focus. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Well, then I have another kind of difficult case that comes up. So, and again, of course, I often think in attachment terms. So, clients with dismissing attachment, I think part and parcel of having missing attachment in my mind is this often this posture of like, no, I'm okay, this is not such a big deal, like I'm not actually upset. And then this serves to not make the attachment bid, not make the request for soothing and comfort and attunement, and thus not to get the rejection that they know is coming.
Mhm.
And so, as part of all of this, when we, let's say, do the discovery process and we see why such and such symptom is necessary in these type cases, it'll go back to, well, whatever, but often it'll go back to an attachment need that the client knows that the old attachment need was not going to be met in the family of origin. But that realization is grief provoking. And to experience grief right now in the therapy session is actually, one can, it's known as like a bid for attachment, a bid for soothing and comfort, and they know not to do that. So then there'll be this kind of, and to be clear, I want to be clear, I don't mean to pathologize this. There's a really good reason to not make the bid for attachment, but then there'll be this like, oh, well, well, it was, oh, well, these kind of things happen. And then, or like then switching over to the parents' view, they had it rough, it was tough for them. anyway, so basically some sort of, we call it dismissal. So what comes up on your end? How do we deal with that in coherence therapy?
Yeah. The first idea that I have is using overt statements to reflect back what you're hearing and maybe add a little bit of understanding how important it is along the lines of, yeah, it's really important to you to have understanding for how difficult your parents had it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really important to you not to have any expectations of them. And let the person sit with that.
Uh-huh.
And,
Mhm.
and there comes in not just what you're hearing the person saying, but your deeper understanding of what's going on there.
Right. How important is the coherence kind of worldview outside of the therapy office in everyday life? Tell me about that, at least, please.
It's essential for having deep and respectful relationships with other people.
Okay.
And for avoiding wars, I might add.
Oh,
But
okay. All right.
anyway,
That's interesting. I'll just say I definitely plan on not making this podcast political at all, but I think this is kind of almost like a meta. This could almost be like a meta political statement. So we can make an exception for this. I wouldn't even mind hearing about that.
yeah. Well, of course, the current events are on my mind, but
Sure.
let me just say that
And the current events being mostly, I guess, the war in
Israel right
Israel
now.
and also in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Sure.
Mm. Yeah, but I'll go right back to the
Yeah.
person that the more deeply steeped I am in the coherence paradigm, the more I really live it.
Oh,
The more I live it, which of course
wow.
is an ongoing, lifelong process. None of us is ever finished
Yeah.
learning and growing. But the more I live it, the more I can understand that people doing crazy things or even things that sort of rub me the wrong way, that is coherent for that person. I'm always working on myself to deepen my assumption of coherence everywhere and around me. I'd like to make a very important point, which is, let's say in personal relationships, that assuming coherence on the other person's part does not mean I have to like what the person is doing.
Right.
But it keeps me from taking all sorts of things personally, keeps me thinking, oh, that person wants to do me harm, or that person has it in for me, or something like that. I mean, that thought almost never occurs to me. I do at times in personal relations say, I don't like this behavior. I'm going to absent myself for a while.
Okay.
Permanently, I mean, that's our good right to take care of ourselves. We should do that. So my sister Robin and I have been fascinated for years by how to bring the idea of the assumption of coherence into everyday life for lay people, for non-therapists. And actually, a few years ago, we put together a website called coherenceinAction.com. It's in your list of websites.
It'll be in the show notes. Look below.
Yeah, good.
Very good.
Where we look at coherence in coaching, coherence in families, coherence in romantic relationships, coherence in the justice system, coherence in organizations, really, really interesting topics. And then at some point we said, it's really on a person-to-person level that this has to start. We need to be able to listen to each other openly, with an assumption of coherence
Mhm.
and not go off the deep end immediately just because we don't agree
Sure.
with or like what the other person is saying.
Mhm.
Try to understand the other person. Try to take on the
Mhm.
anthropologist's curiosity
Yep.
about
Yep.
why does this make sense to that other person.
Mhm.
And that's when we got together with Bruce, whom I've
Mhm.
mentioned many times today, and the three of us wrote the listening
Yeah.
book, which you
Right.
also mentioned before.
Right.
And this is our attempt to bring to everyone,
Mhm.
non-therapists,
Mhm.
therapists too, why not? The concept of coherence in listening. And we even have
Mhm.
examples in there.
Okay.
How
If you want, launch into an
really,
example. I think people would benefit from that.
yeah. We have examples of how, well, first of all, there are many examples. There are more than 50 vignettes
Uh-huh.
that are really entertaining reading and also make some very important points and
Mhm.
lessons and so on. Uh, in addition, we have 3 case studies where someone simply feeling listened to
Oh.
and understood
Yeah.
was in a position to look at things in a slightly new way
Uh-huh.
and make some deep changes.
Mhm.
For example,
Mhm.
there's one woman in there who always felt ashamed and embarrassed because her apartment was always a mess. And she always met her friends at a diner on the corner
Mhm.
because she wouldn't let anybody into her apartment.
Mm.
And just by being listened to by her best friend,
Yeah.
and just having her friend reflect back with no agenda of her own,
Mhm.
the woman came to the realization that these were some pressures and
Yeah.
expectations that she had gotten from her mother over the years,
Mhm.
and that she had learned to feel ashamed
Mhm.
of not meeting her mother's standards and so on. And just that awareness, what we call integration
Mhm.
into awareness, enabled her to make some new, more adult choices.
Yeah. Yeah. I think just this attunement, deep listening, it seems like it's easily 50% of the therapeutic process. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Feeling heard, seen, understood. It's what we all long for, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. And then so we'll wrap it up shortly, but just to maybe be mildly provocative, yeah. How might this model apply to political problems, even war, etc.? Just launch into it in a leisurely
Mhm.
way. What do you think?
Hmm. Well, maybe that's a macrocosm of, for example, some coherence work that I've done with couples. You
Ah,
could call them
okay.
warring parties, right?
Totally. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. Okay.
And how I approach that is to do sort of alternatingly with the
Mm,
other one listening,
mm,
coherence work,
mhm.
recognizing what that person wants to change, and then looking for the underlying emotional truths.
Yeah,
And then what I add on to that is to ask the partner to repeat what
yeah,
he or she
yeah.
has just heard by being in that other person's shoes,
Right.
repeating it in a way that doesn't pathologize,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't
Mm-hmm.
criticize, and so on, which is a very difficult exercise for some people at
Yeah, yeah,
first.
yeah. Especially
Yeah.
when emotionally dysregulated and angry at the other person.
Yeah, you take it in
Mm.
small steps.
Yeah.
Coherence therapy is very effective that way for
Mm-hmm.
warring spouse parties.
Right,
Uh,
right, right.
and it's basically the same concept.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh,
Really allowing people, even
mhm.
if it's, negotiating parties, allowing them to say what they really want to say.
Yeah, yeah. And
Uh,
knowing that they have their reasons. You don't have to agree with them, but there are reasons for the maybe even extreme view that the other party has.
right.
Hmm.
And then asking the other party to hear it,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
feed it back, to show
yeah,
that it's really been understood. And then you
yeah.
reverse roles.
Right. What you're describing is very similar to the Imago technique. Have you heard of it?
You actually mentioned it to me once, yeah.
Yeah. And it's like,
Yeah.
so like the one party speaks, they're not interrupted. Then the other party summarizes what the other party said in a kind of steel man kind of way, where it's like they're steel man opposed to straw man, where they're really making the arguments compellingly from that other person's perspective, attuning
Mhm.
with them, being empathetic as they do, and then they switch roles when they're ready. Yep.
Mhm. Mhm. It really broadens our horizons to do things like that.
Oh, totally.
I remember being in a debate club when I was in junior high school,
Yeah.
and I, as a vegetarian, had to take the side
Uh,
of it's good to eat meat.
that must have been extremely comfortable for you.
Yeah, there were no disconfirming experiences. I didn't change anything.
Well,
But it's a
okay.
great exercise.
Your mind was broadened nonetheless.
It was.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, hey, on that cheery note, while we wrap it up,
Great. It's really been fun.
yeah, well, thank you very much, Elise. Again, we'll link to all your contact information. We'll link to the book in the show notes. Yep. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for inviting me. See you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.